Michael Carter woke with the sky still the color of cold tin, the alarm breathing a quiet buzz that never rattled him anymore. Habit, not heroism, swung his feet to the floorboards. He brewed coffee that tasted like his father's lectures and stood for a moment at the kitchen window, watching a single porch light across the street pulse like a slow heartbeat. In the small bedroom down the hall, Emily stirred, then thudded out barefoot, a blanket dragging behind her like a cape. "Morning," she yawned. "Morning, Em," Michael said, and the word landed somewhere warm inside his ribs. Their breakfasts were always quick and unpretentious cereal for her. Toast for him because the day in Willow Creek unfurled on its own schedule, and you learned early not to stand in its way. Michael packed her lunch with the same care he used to torque bolts. An apple shining like a little planet. Peanut butter sandwiches squared to the edges. A heart of folded napkin. Then they set out, he for the shop on Maple, she for school at the corner where the crossing guard, Mrs. Lyle, knew the gossip of every household by the tilt of its curtains. By early afternoon, rain stitched the valley. The lanes of Highway 19 gleamed with a dull glaze, and beyond the guardrails, the fields looked brushed with pewter. Michael drove the old F-150 that would outlast him, if given the chance. Emily in the passenger seat inventing games that made arithmetic behave. He was thinking about a stubborn alternator waiting back at the shop, and she was thinking about Friday's spelling test, when the black sedan appeared like a punctuation mark on the shoulder hood, rising like an indignant eyebrow, hazard lights blinking too calm for an emergency. "Dad," Emily said, already leaning forward. "She needs help." Michael felt the usual tug of weariness. Dinner still a rumor. Invoices waiting. An engine he'd promised by morning, but habit cut a deeper groove than fatigue. He eased onto the gravel, and rain whispered against the windshield in a busy, orderly fuss. The woman standing by the car had the sort of coat that made rain reconsider itself. Her hair was tucked back neatly, her expression composed in a way that suggested she spent her days outsourcing panic. When she turned, though, something flickered in Michael's chest, half recognition, half nostalgia, like catching the scent of an old summer through an open door. "Car trouble?" he called, already stepping out. "It just died," she said, trying to smile. "Roadside assistance is on their way." "But they're optimistic about the timeline." Michael nodded. "Pop the hood?" She did, and steam sighed out as if the car had been holding its breath. Emily hopped down beside him, the way she always did, as if she'd arrived on this earth to be his assistant. "My dad can fix anything," she said with the unqualified faith of 9. The woman's smile softened then, and she bent a little to meet Emily's eyes. "That's a useful superpower." Michael unlatched the hood, then leaned in. The engine bay was pretty on purpose, clean, compact, everything tucked under plastic, like a secret but beauty often disguised screw-ups. He checked the battery leads, the fuses, the snarl of wiring beneath the panel. He traced the fault like a trail only he could see, rain pooling in the curve of the hood, his breath ghosting against cold metal. A loose connection, a sulking ground. He tightened what needed tightening, reseated the plug, waited a beat, then said, "Try it." The woman slid behind the wheel. The engine turned obedient and smooth, like a pupil deciding to behave. She exhaled and killed the hazards, then stepped back out, her expression widening into relief, into gratitude. "You're a lifesaver," she said. "Please, what do I owe you?" Michael shook his head, wiping water from his brow with the back of his hand. "Nothing. You were going to be stuck half an hour otherwise. Glad we were passing." She studied him then with a focus that made the rain recede. "I'm Sophia," she said. "Sophia Reynolds." The name moved through Michael like a ghost opening the wrong door. He hadn't heard it in years and had spent years pretending he didn't want to. Sophia Reynolds. Girl next door once upon a time. Fireworks reflected in her eyes. River mud on their knees. The last day before she left, he held his face together because he'd learned how. "Michael Carter," he said. "This is my daughter, Emily." Sophia crouched to Emily's height, with a grace that wasn't practiced so much as remembered. "Emily," she said, "thank you for the loan of your dad." "You're welcome," Emily said, pronouncing it with the gravity of a judge. "Do you like chocolate pie?" Sophia blinked, surprised into a laugh. "I do, actually." "Good," Emily said. "Because Dot's Diner has the best." Rain nudged them all back toward their vehicles. Michael tipped 2 fingers by way of farewell. Sophia watched him with an expression that hovered between present and past, then slid into the sedan and pulled onto the road, the taillights dwindling in a red translation of distance. Michael did not look at Emily. Emily did not look at Michael. They both held a silence that understood too much. That night the kitchen light made a shallow golden lake. Emily read on the couch with the blanket seaming over her. Michael stood at the counter, staring at a photograph that lived in the bottom drawer because he never decided to throw it away. 2 kids in damp clothes, hair sunned to lighter at the tips, his father's old truck behind them like a promise they believed they could keep. He turned the picture face down. The rain tapped the window like someone practicing the rhythm of a forgotten song. The next morning, he found reasons to stay busy inside the garage. And the garage gave gladly brake pads, a whining serpentine belt, the old Buick that refused to idle below a mutter. The bell over the door chimed just before noon, and Dot from the diner leaned in with pies, cut too generously, and rumor half formed. "Got a customer asking for you by name," she said. "Fancy coat, not from around here." Michael didn't have to ask. Sophia came in a minute later with 2 coffees, and that particular look some people wore when they were trying to make a current conversation stand in for the one they'd avoided. "Hi," she said carefully. "I thought I should make sure the connection you fixed is still connected." Emily popped up from the stool where she did homework and sketches of improbable vehicles. "We have lemon pie," she announced. "Do you like lemon pie?" Almost irresponsibly, Sophia said, and the tension loosened by a notch. They ate pie off paper plates at the corner table, as if it were a practice of community. Michael kept his hands busy turning a socket through its sizes. He glanced up and found Sophia looking not at the shop, not at Emily, but at him with a sorrow underlay he didn't trust yet. He set down the tool, as if it weighed more than it should. "Your car's fine," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to stop by anyway." Emily stepped into the silence like a woman stepping between 2 men with swords. "Sophia, do you know how to braid hair?" "I do," Sophia said, surprised and pleased. "Good," Emily said. "Because Dad's okay at it, but he doesn't understand the physics of ribbons." "The physics of ribbons," Michael repeated, letting the absurdity soften the moment. "The physics of everything," Emily corrected, then slid her stool closer to Sophia with the nonchalance of someone who believed kindness was the default. Sophia's fingers moved through Emily's hair, as if all the meetings and flights of her adult life had been rehearsals for the patience braided into this minute. Michael watched them as if he'd wandered into a room in which time moved differently. Sophia didn't say she recognized him. He didn't say her name again, as if repeating it might conjure a story he hadn't consented to. They stood inside the pleasant shallows of small-talk school projects, the county fair coming up, the baseball team that surprised everyone every other year, while the deeper current tugged at their ankles. She left with a promise to bring a list of strange noises her sedan allegedly made. He nodded as if she'd invented a genre of science. When the bell chimed her out, Emily looked at him and didn't pretend not to know something had gathered. "You knew her," she said. "Once," he said, then returned to the Buick with a preoccupation that was a little too loud to be called focus. Afternoons bled into evenings. Sophia came back with cups of coffee that had traveled well and stories that had traveled farther. She listened to customers as if their sentences were worth finishing whenever they wanted. She remembered the names of their dogs. She learned that Mrs. Lyle had guarded the same crosswalk since the county sold the old library and the new one landed with too much glass in the wrong neighborhood. She learned that Dot saved the best slices for the kids who paid in coins. She learned Michael laughed differently with a wrench in his hand, freer, as if the work gave him permission to like himself. No one mentioned the summers at the river, the bicycle with a limp wheel, the night she said she was leaving for 2 weeks and left forever. He did not ask. She did not answer. And yet something in her gaze negotiated silently every time she let herself look at him. Emily, sovereign of beginnings, tied them together with little strings. Dinner invitations, borrowed library books, three-person jokes that only worked if they arrived together. The town festival shouldered its way onto the calendar like an old friend with a beloved bad habit. Lights scaffolded the riverbank. A tilt-a-whirl announced its readiness, with a creak and a bravado hum. The smell of kettle corn persuaded even stubborn pockets. The brass band sounded braver from a distance. Michael bought tickets, and lost them, and bought more. Emily ran ahead, then ran back, her hand finding his without looking. They found Sophia in the lemonade line, holding 2 cups, as if that would spare her the empty-handed sameness of being alone in a crowd. She brightened. Actually brightened when she spotted them. Emily accepted 1 lemonade with the dignity of a diplomat and tugged Sophia toward the carousel. "Do you ride?" Emily asked. "I haven't in a while," Sophia said. "Neither has Dad," Emily declared. "But he pretends the horses make him dizzy." "I don't pretend," Michael said, amused and defensive in equal measure. They climbed aboard anyway, the child confident, the woman tentative, the man resigned to love them both enough to do what he avoided. The carousel revolved and reissued the past in oddly perfect bits. The rise and fall, the lights, the mirrors promising joy close at hand. It paused the world long enough to imagine that all necessary decisions could be made in a circle without edges. Afterward, they stood in the lilac bruise of twilight, negotiating fried dough versus corn dogs. Emily, full of diplomacy, chose both. Sophia held napkins as if they were part of some ceremonial duty. Michael watched her profile, and the past stepped forward so cleanly he tasted river water and heat lightning. "Michael," she said quietly, catching him looking. "Do you, Dad?" Emily's voice cut the air. He spun, and saw nothing where she should be. The crowd was a grammar of elbows and laughter, color and motion misbehaving. "Em?" he shouted once, the sound already ragged. He moved fast without running, shouldering through bodies, using voice and height and a father's right to panic. Sophia followed, scanning with a predator's focus, making herself the boundary between nonsense and need. The brass band burst into something cheerful. The cheerful made everything worse. Sophia angled toward the bandstand as if memory or instinct had guided her. There, in the dark underbelly of the bleachers, she found a small shape folded into itself. Fingers laced over ears. Eyes shut hard against too many sounds. "Emily," Sophia said, kneeling and touching her shoulder. "It's too loud, isn't it? Can I sit with you a minute?" Emily nodded without looking. Sophia spoke in a register children trusted, precise, plain, honest, and slowed the world to something survivable. When Michael reached them seconds later, breath thunder in his throat, he saw not a disaster, but a circle. Sophia holding Emily. Emily holding herself together. Him held by the side of both. "It got too noisy," Emily said to him, the words wobbling. "I know," he said, kneeling, his hand on her back, his everything present. "I'm here. We're here." They stayed there long enough for the music to spend itself on something else, for the lights to stop being aggressive and return to being lights. When Emily finally stood, she took one of Michael's hands and one of Sophia's, and they moved through the crowd as if a bargain had been struck with whatever gods monitored fathers and daughters and all necessary redemptions. Back at the truck, Sophia squeezed Emily's fingers. "You tell me next time it starts to feel like too much," she said. "I'll help you find the quiet." Emily nodded, a little person making a little promise. She surprised both of them by leaning into Sophia fiercely for a second. Then she let go, climbed in, and arranged her blanket around her knees as if they'd invented a safer way to sit. Sophia stepped back. The air between her and Michael changed shape and temperature. If he'd taken a step forward then, he would have discovered he'd been standing on a bridge the whole time. "Thank you," he said. And the words felt inadequately engineered for the job. "Of course," she said, and the words meant more than they seemed to say. Days feathered forward. Something unlonely installed itself in Michael's kitchen. He found himself picturing an extra plate, an extra laugh. He invited Sophia to dinner, and oversalted the chicken because he was either nervous or 12. The three of them ate at the small table that had known too much quiet. Emily narrated school with operatic conviction. Sophia listened like it was news that couldn't be found anywhere else. Michael watched them both and let an egg crack to let something else in. After they'd washed dishes and broken into Dot's pie, Michael stood with Sophia on the porch where the night smelled like tomatoes and rain on wood. The town lay around them like a hand cupped around a secret. "I kept a picture," he said, surprising himself. "I know," she said softly. "Emily found it." "I didn't mean to keep it," he added, which was both true and false. "I didn't mean to leave," she answered. Which was true, and not enough. She told him then how her father had decided leaving was an upgrade rather than a loss, how letters failed to find him, because the man at the mailbox and the man in the big house agreed that teenagers didn't know the value of promises. She told him about the college she was supposed to like and the city that taught her to say "I'm fine" in 5 efficient ways. She told him success came loudly, and loneliness came dressed as fatigue. She told him the only sentence she had never learned to say without breaking was "I'm sorry." "You could have tried harder," Michael said quietly because those words had lived in his mouth for years, taking up too much room. "I know," she said. "I've forgiven my father for what he stole, and I've forgiven myself for letting him. But I haven't asked you to forgive me. I'm asking now." The porch held its breath. Somewhere a dog barked like a punctuation mark. Michael leaned against the rail and felt the old hurt present but not sovereign. "I don't know," he said. "I'm a slow decider when it matters." "I'm not going anywhere tonight," she said, which was either a promise or a plan or both. Sophia's world pressed back with tidy insistence. Emails bright with urgency. Calls stacked like dishes in a sink after a party. A board wanted answers. An investor wanted presents. A glossy magazine wanted a profile that read like a pilgrimage. Meanwhile, Willow Creek wanted what small towns always want: authenticity, attendance, another set of hands when a storm took down the old oak on 4th. Sophia answered some calls and ignored others, and discovered that ignoring, once a terrifying sport, could be a skill. She sat with Emily on the porch steps, learning star names out of a library book with a cracked spine, and felt 15 again, and safer than she'd ever been at 15. She walked to the shop with coffee and found reasons to stay through lunch. She paid Dot in cash and coins, and learned that currency could be fondness. Michael allowed hope in like a stray cat. Cautious, suspicious, already half in his lap. He taught Emily to swap out wiper blades, and taught himself to ask Sophia not what her schedule allowed, but what her heart wanted. He sometimes reached mid-sentence for the old sarcasm that had protected him and did not find it where it used to be. The argument, when it finally came, was gentle, a tremor rather than a quake. Sophia had been offered a project that would tie her to a city skyline for a year, and tie her to rooms that never opened onto porches. "It's important," she said correctly. "It would set up the next 5 years," she said, not incorrectly. "I won't ask you to stay," Michael said, his jaw a carefully engineered hinge. "You don't need another person telling you what your life has to be." "I wish you would," she said. Not because she needed permission, but because she wanted a reason that sounded like a request. Emily listened from the stairs, the names of constellations in her lap. Later, she would draw a heart around 2 names, and then erase it because she was superstitious about tempting fate. They slept that night in houses that felt like rooms borrowed from a hotel. The next morning, the garage sounded emptier, and the city office felt like a museum exhibit about a woman pretending the glass walls scheduled the light. Sophia drove beyond the last stoplight, past the feed store and the retired billboard, to a brick warehouse abandoned so long it had begun to imagine itself as a memory. She walked through it with a contractor, and the kind of optimism not everyone can afford. She bought it with money that would have looked better on a quarterly report, and felt something inside her shift from velocity to gravity. She brought the papers to Michael, like a child bringing a drawing for the refrigerator. "A community garage," she said breathless. "Training for high schoolers. Bay's small businesses can rent by the hour. A classroom. Scholarships. A place that says, engines aren't mysteries, And your life doesn't have to be either. Michael stared at the floor plans that smelled like dust and ambition and didn't know whether to laugh or pray. "You can leave me," he said finally, words gentler than their shape. "But don't leave this town worse than you found it." "I won't," she said. And the way she said it made a contract out of oxygen. The town council scheduled a hearing on rezoning. Her board scheduled a vote on her priorities, which is to say on her. The dates collided like cousins at a wedding. Family, but not friendly. "You can only be in one room," Michael said neutrally, offering facts instead of advice. "I've spent years in rooms that didn't ask me to do anything but be impressive," Sophia said. "Maybe it's time to be useful." She chose the council meeting. The room smelled like coffee gone honest and old wood warmed by too many summers. Mrs. Lyle sat in the back with a stack of petitions. Dot fanned herself with a church bulletin. Michael stood against the wall with grease, kissing the cuticles of his fingers like permanent evidence. Sophia spoke without flourish. She told them what engines had taught her. Torque is trust, pressure is predictable. And if you treat the thread right, it will hold. She told them what the city had taught her. You can build towers out of numbers and call them success and still not cast a shadow on anything that needs shade. She told them what Michael and Emily had reminded her. The future isn't a skyline, it's a kitchen table. When she finished, even the old air conditioner took a respectful pause. Then the room loosened into human sounds, and the vote was taken. And for once, the process looked like the promise. The council said yes. The board, polite and ruthless, said no to her, or at least to the version of her who made them feel stable. They appointed an interim, offered kind words that creaked like old chairs, and wished her well as if she were the one traveling. She drove back to the warehouse, a place that had decided to believe in itself, and stood in a rectangle of light thick with dust and possibility. Michael joined her without asking where to be. Emily spun in the empty space and declared the echo a feature. They raised money the way small towns do. Bake sales, weaponized into community, a charity car wash, a silent auction where the silence needed reminders. Contractors who owed Michael favors found their calendars had gaps. Teenagers who owed Dot the cost of a dozen pies found that sweat was currency. The roof stopped leaking. The windows learned to be windows again. Someone painted the front door a blue that looked like optimism dressed for work. On opening day, fluorescent lights hummed like contented bees. Sophia cut a ribbon and looked more astonished than ceremonial. Michael taught torque with analogies, teenagers saved for later. Emily painted a mural of a car with wings and a smiling grille, because in her experience, machines that could fly and smile mostly did good. They worked until tiredness became honest, rather than defeating. At night, they ate at the small table, with an extra plate that had found its way home. On the porch, Michael took Sophia's hand in front of Emily, because secrets had stopped being useful. "Stay," he said, not as a command, but as a blessing he'd finally learned to pronounce. "For real, this time." "I am," she said. "For real." They did not sign anything that night except the attendance sheet of their own lives. Sophia resigned the title that had made strangers nod in airports. She discovered payroll for apprentices made more sense in her body than executive bonuses ever had. She learned how to stock vending machines with snacks that weren't an insult. She learned names and the stories attached to them. She learned she slept better when morning promised the sound of a socket set instead of an elevator. Winter arrived with a modesty the town approved of. The river slowed, but didn't sulk. At the garage, frost laced the windows in ferns the teenagers photographed before class. Sophia bought space heaters and learned where the outlet tripped if you begged it wrong. Michael explained why an engine prefers patience to force. Emily built forts out of old tires and math problems. Michael kept the old photograph but moved it. It no longer lived in the bottom drawer with the things too tender to survive daylight. It joined others on a wall: Emily, with missing teeth and mischief. Sophia teaching torque like a foreign language you could master. The first apprentice grinning beside the first car they coaxed back to life. The old photo became one story among many, a chapter rather than a closed book. Sometimes on Sundays they walked to the river and tried to tell where the past had been absorbed. The water solved for obstacles as it always had. Michael would touch Sophia's sleeve, the way a man checks that a good tool is still within reach. Emily would skip stones and pretend the skips were syllables in a language she invented. "Do you miss it?" Michael asked once. "Meaning the city. Meaning a different gravity. I miss the version of me who knew where to be every hour, because a calendar told her," Sophia said. "But I don't miss being late to my own life." He nodded. And the nod contained the part of him that had feared she'd go. And the part that knew letting her stay was a choice he had to make daily. Spring made a spectacle of itself. The warehouse door rolled up to let in air embarrassingly clean. The training program filled. A kid who'd been rehearsing bitterness found he liked the way a good engine answered to his hands. A grandmother sent a pie with a note that said, "You saved my son," which is to say, "You saved me." Sophia cried in the office and pretended it was allergies until Michael found her and did not pretend. They disagreed sometimes about a budget line, about whether the annex could wait, about Emily's bedtime on festival nights. The arguments were better than the old silence. They learned to tag in and tag out. They learned to apologize while everything was still salvageable. They learned they were building something more mechanical than romance and more romantic than a machine. A life with tolerances and torque specs you discovered by doing. On an ordinary Thursday, Emily burst into the office holding a flyer. "School career day," she announced. "Can you both come? Dad talks about torque. Sophia talks about business. I talk about how not to panic in crowds." Michael and Sophia looked at each other and laughed, because sometimes life wrote punchlines faster than it wrote its setups. Career day went fine, until the fire alarm hiccuped itself into an actual alarm. For a beat, the room became the worst version of itself, noise rising like a wave. Emily's hand found Sophia's without hunting. Sophia bent and spoke the sentence that had saved them once already. "We'll find the quiet." They did. Even while moving. Even while everybody was moving. Because sometimes quiet is not a place, but a company. That night, under a sky with more stars than arguments, Emily declared that being scared was like a storm. You didn't have to love it, but you could respect it and learn where to wait it out. Michael kissed the crown of her head and thought that wisdom shows up when you've fed it. Summer made the garage loud with fans and the kind of music teenagers pretend not to like and then sing anyway. The warehouse hosted a community dinner with mismatched chairs and a grilled sweetness in the air. People brought what they could, dishes, stories, themselves. Michael said a few words that sounded like the man his father thought he could be, and the man he'd learned to become. Sophia said fewer words, and they did more work. Later, when the yard had been returned to order by hands that wanted to do such work, Michael and Sophia stood by the door with paper cups of lemonade, like a ritual had been completed. He looked at her and saw the city's shine without its solitude, the small town's humility without its fear. He thought that he had been waiting at a shoulder for a stalled vehicle, and what he had fixed was something far larger than he'd been trained for. "I love you," he said, not as a performance, but as a field report. "I love you," she said, and the sentence felt like opening a tool roll and finding everything in its proper place. They kissed, not like teenagers practicing with bravado, but like adults who knew where they were in the story and why it mattered to keep going. Inside, Emily whooped and pretended she was embarrassed and was actually relieved that the world continued to behave. In the years that followed, because years do follow when you keep making room for them, the program grew in the same way that things grow when they remember their purpose. Some of the kids left and came back with skills. Some stayed and became the people other kids pointed at when asked for proof. The warehouse got an annex and a better bathroom. The mural kept its wings and, in one corner, acquired a small cat. Emily insisted. Looked like Michael's soul. The city never quite forgave Sophia for choosing a room they didn't control, but it learned how to tell her story without making her absence the point. She visited sometimes and remembered to leave before the rooms took more than they gave. She learned the satisfaction of being missed by the right people in the right places. Michael's shop did what good shops do. He hired an apprentice who could hear a timing belt's confession at 20 paces. He raised his prices slightly, and his standards not at all. He went to bed tired for better reasons. He woke with the alarm because he liked the hour before the house woke. He learned that a life built in a small place could be vast enough to stand inside without ducking. Emily grew in ways that made strangers say the word poised, and made people who knew her say the word true. She kept a list of people she wanted to remember to thank, and revised it often. She learned to drive in a parking lot, and then on the highway, and then in weather. She loved a boy, and then didn't, and then learned the difference between being hurt and being harmed. She declared that torque was a metaphor, and refused to elaborate. Sometimes, on the way home from the warehouse, they passed the place on Highway 19, where a black sedan once lifted its hood like a question. The shoulder was just a shoulder again, the way holy places always look after you leave them. Michael would glance at Sophia. Sophia would glance at Michael. Emily would roll her eyes fondly, because she had invented that expression for the occasions when her parents were being cinematic. What they hadn't known back then was that the roadside incident was not a beginning but a merge lane. Two separate roads aligning by grace and choice into one. Not narrower, not lonelier, not more crowded than necessary. Just one road with room enough for the truck and the sedan, and a girl who could find the quiet when the world got loud, and for whoever else needed to follow the taillights home.